Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. I was 14 years old, stuck at home during the summer before my freshman year of high school, and completely bored. It was one of those stretches of time where the days feel endless and empty, and your mind starts looking for something, anything, to occupy itself. My parents had already gone through a messy divorce, and although I knew bits and pieces of what had happened between them, I had the sense that there were details I didn't fully understand. I think at that age, I was angry and confused in ways I didn't know how to process. Looking back now, I can admit that part of me was searching for reasons to justify that anger. One afternoon, while my mom was out, I started going through the filing cabinet she kept at home. It wasn't locked or hidden. It was just there, filled with old paperwork, bills, legal documents, and folders from years past. At the time, my motivation wasn't noble. I was hoping to find something related to my parents' divorce, something ugly or revealing that would help me fuel the resentment I already felt. Teenage logic isn't always kind or rational. As I flipped through the manila folders, most of them were boring and unremarkable. Utility bills, old tax documents, random paperwork that meant nothing to me. Then I saw one folder that caught my attention. It was labeled with a single year, 1980. I had no idea what it could be. My mom wasn't one to keep things for no reason, but I couldn't immediately connect that year to anything significant. Curious, I pulled the folder out and opened it. What I found inside was not what I expected, not even remotely. The folder was thick, packed with documents, court transcripts, police reports, medical paperwork, typed statements. As I started reading, my confusion slowly turned into disbelief and then into something heavier that I didn't yet have the words for. The documents described an incident that happened in 1980 when my mom was 23 years old. According to the reports, she had been held captive for several hours and repeatedly raped. I remember sitting there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was reading. This wasn't gossip or rumor. This was official paperwork, evidence, records, proof. Until that moment, I had never heard this story. My mom had never mentioned it, not once. To me, she had always been strong, unbreakable, almost invincible. She was a single mother who worked hard, protected me, and carried herself with confidence. Reading about something so horrific happening to her shattered that image in a way I wasn't prepared for. According to the documents at the time, my mom lived on Balboa Island in Newport Beach, California. She shared an apartment there with a roommate. They had lived in that area for about 5 years. Balboa Island was, and still is, a lively place. It has a boardwalk, arcades, ferries, and a relaxed surfer vibe. It's the kind of place people associate with safety, leisure, and community, not violent crime. One night, my mom's roommate went out on a date, and my mom stayed home. At some point during the evening, the roommate called and said she had forgotten her keys. She asked my mom to leave the sliding door unlocked so she could get in later. It was a simple request, a small act of trust. My mom agreed, assuming that leaving the slider unlocked for a few hours wouldn't be a problem. They had lived there for years without incident. The neighborhood felt safe. There was no reason to think anything terrible would happen. Later that night, my mom went to bed. She was woken up by a man she didn't recognize straddling her, pinning her shoulders down. One of his hands was covering her nose and mouth, cutting off her ability to scream or breathe properly. She was instantly terrified, disoriented, and helpless. The reports described how he tore decorative fabric from her pillows, used it to restrain her, and forced fabric into her mouth to silence her. Over the next several hours, he raped her multiple times. In between assaults, he moved through the apartment, gathering anything valuable he could find. He treated the space like it belonged to him, as if her presence there meant nothing. At one point, he came back and lay down next to her, continuing to assault her in different ways before raping her again. Eventually, he took her car keys and left, driving away in her vehicle and leaving her tied up and alone. The entire ordeal lasted over 3 hours. As I read this, sitting on the floor of my childhood home, I felt sick. I tried to imagine my mom in that situation, terrified, powerless, waiting in silence, not knowing if he was truly gone or if he would come back. It was unbearable. After he left, she managed to untie herself. She tried to use the phone, only to discover that he had ripped them out of the wall. With no way to call for help, she went to a neighbor's apartment. They called the police, and she was taken to the hospital. A report was filed for her stolen car. She was released from the hospital a few hours later, by which time it was already morning. That's when her roommate finally came home. The roommate had stayed the night at her date's place and hadn't called to say she wouldn't be returning. According to the documents, she was devastated when she learned what had happened. At the time I read this, I remember feeling a deep anger toward that roommate. Even as a teenager, I couldn't understand how someone could be so careless. A few days later, the police located the stolen car in the East San Diego area near the border. The car had been heavily damaged. The man was arrested. He turned out to be an undocumented immigrant from Tijuana who was already wanted for other crimes. My mom had to go through the process of identifying him in a lineup and later testifying against him. He was convicted and sentenced to 22 years in prison. I closed the folder and just sat there for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just stared at nothing, trying to reconcile the woman I knew with the woman described in those documents. It was terrifying to realize that my mom, the person I depended on most in the world, had gone through something so brutal and had carried it silently for decades. What surprised me most was learning that she had never gone to counseling afterward. She never became overly paranoid. She didn't install elaborate security systems or talk constantly about safety. She lived her life, raised me, and somehow moved forward. That day changed something in me. Later, I talked to my mom about what I had found. She didn't get angry. She didn't tell me I shouldn't have looked. She answered my questions honestly, though carefully. I realized that reading about it as a 14-year-old was terrifying, but it also did something important for my understanding of the world. At the time, we lived in a safe neighborhood only about 10 miles from where the incident had happened. I understood in a very real way that danger doesn't always announce itself and that safety is never guaranteed by location alone. From that point on, I became the one who took personal and home safety seriously. I learned lessons secondhand from what had happened to her. I pay attention to my surroundings. I take self-defense classes regularly. I carry protection appropriate to the situation, whether that's pepper spray, a knife, or a firearm where legal and necessary. I never wear both earbuds at once. I double-check locks. I trust my instincts. I am willing to be rude, strange, or uncomfortable if something feels off. My grandma did not tell us this story until she was terminally ill with ovarian cancer. By the time she finally spoke about it, she knew she did not have much time left. It wasn't something she ever brought up casually, and growing up, none of us had any idea that something like this had ever happened to her. She was the kind of woman who carried things quietly, the kind who focused on taking care of others rather than talking about herself. One of my uncles, Ted, was born with spina bifida. For anyone unfamiliar with the condition, it is a serious birth defect that affects the spinal cord. Depending on the severity, it can cause significant physical limitations and requires ongoing medical care. Today, there are far more treatment options and support systems available. But back in the 1960s, care for a condition like that was limited, especially in rural areas. My family is from southwestern Wisconsin, a region that is beautiful but very isolated. Small towns are spread far apart, and at that time, there were not many hospitals equipped to handle complex medical needs. Whenever Ted needed treatment, which was often, my family had to travel all the way to Madison. That meant a 2-hour drive each way, sometimes longer depending on weather and road conditions. My grandma adored Ted. She loved all her children deeply, but Ted required more attention and care, and she never hesitated to give it. Even though she had 5 other kids at home to look after, she insisted on being the one to take Ted to his medical appointments whenever possible. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for help. She just did what needed to be done. Looking back, it's hard not to see her as a saint. These trips to Madison became a regular part of her life. Long drives on quiet highways, medical appointments, waiting rooms, and then the long drive home again. It was exhausting, but she never treated it like a burden. To her, it was simply part of being a mother. One night, after one of these trips, my grandma and Ted were driving back home. It was late, and the weather had taken a turn. A heavy fog had settled over the area, thick enough to blur the road ahead and swallow the edges of everything around them. Visibility was poor, and the darkness made it worse. The road between Madison and their town was a single-lane highway. There were no exit ramps like modern highways have. Instead, there were occasional side roads that connected directly to the highway, often without much warning. There were no turn lanes, no lights, and very little room for error. You had to be alert at all times, especially at night. My grandma was driving carefully, gripping the steering wheel and straining her eyes to see through the fog. Ted was sitting in the front passenger seat beside her. The car moved steadily forward, the sound of the tires on the pavement and the faint hum of the engine filling the silence. Everything felt tense, but routine. This was a drive she had made countless times before. Then suddenly she heard a voice. It was loud and clear, cutting through the quiet of the car. "Stop!" Without thinking, my grandma slammed on the brakes. The car came to a complete stop in the middle of the highway. It was an instinctive reaction, immediate and absolute. She didn't question it. She didn't hesitate. Her body responded before her mind had time to catch up. Not even a second later, a massive semi-truck burst into view from one of the side roads. The truck had blown through a stop sign, likely unseen due to the fog, and crossed the highway at full speed directly in front of them. The sound of it was thunderous. The sheer size of it filled their view as it passed. If my grandma had not stopped when she did, their car would have been hit broadside by the truck. Given the speed and size of the semi, there is little doubt that they would not have survived the impact. The force would have crushed the car, and there would have been nothing they could do. But they were stopped. The truck passed, disappearing into the fog on the other side of the road, leaving silence behind it. My grandma sat there, frozen, her heart racing, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. The realization of how close they had come to dying hit her all at once. She didn't move the car right away. She needed a moment. Her breathing was shallow, and she could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Ted sat beside her, quiet and still, likely just as shocked. After a few moments, once the immediate rush of fear began to fade and her blood pressure returned to something closer to normal, my grandma finally spoke. She turned to Ted, still shaken, and said something like, "Thank God you said something. We could have been killed." She truly believed Ted had shouted the warning. It made sense to her. He was sitting right next to her. She had heard a voice. In her mind, it had to be him. Ted looked at her, confused. He told her he hadn't said anything. At first, my grandma probably thought he was mistaken or joking, but Ted insisted. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't done anything at all. The realization settled slowly and heavily between them. The car was still stopped in the middle of the road, fog swirling around them, the night pressing in close. My grandma replayed the moment in her head. The voice, the clarity of it, the urgency. She knew what she had heard. But it hadn't come from Ted. They didn't talk much about it after that. My grandma eventually drove them home, both of them shaken, both of them quiet. Life went on, as it tends to do. There were more doctor visits, more long drives, more responsibilities waiting for her, and as always, she carried it all without complaint. She never told this story while she was healthy. She never brought it up at family gatherings or during casual conversations. It stayed with her, unspoken, for decades. Maybe she didn't know how to explain it. Maybe she didn't think anyone would believe her. Or maybe she simply accepted it as one of those moments in life that doesn't have a clear explanation. It wasn't until she was facing the end of her life that she finally shared it with us. When she told it, she wasn't dramatic. She didn't embellish it or draw conclusions. She just told us what happened, exactly as she remembered it. Listening to her tell that story was unsettling, not because of the truck or the near accident alone, but because of the voice, the timing, the impossibility of it. There was no logical explanation that fit neatly, and my grandma wasn't the type of person to make things up or seek attention. She loved her family. She loved Ted. She did everything she could to protect her children, often at great personal cost. Whether the voice came from somewhere we can't understand, or whether it was some instinct so powerful it felt external, none of us can say for sure. What we do know is this: if she had not stopped when she did, my uncle and my grandma would not have lived long enough for any of us to be here listening to that story. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and my mind drifts back to her words, I still wonder who or what told her to stop. When I first walked up to the bus stop that day, I didn't think anything unusual was going to happen. It was just another normal school morning, the kind that blends into every other one when you're that age. Same place, same routine, same group of people standing around waiting for the bus. Over time, you start to recognize faces, even if you don't really know anyone well. That morning, I noticed them standing there again. They were already familiar to me by then. I had seen them at the bus stop plenty of times before, always together, always talking to each other in low, excited voices. I never really paid much attention to them until that day. Something about their energy stood out to me, not in a threatening way, just different. I walked over and, without much thought, asked what they were up to. The reaction was immediate. They stepped closer to me, way closer than what felt comfortable. Before I could even register how little personal space they were giving me, they started talking. Not just talking, but rambling, jumping from topic to topic without pause. It felt like being hit by a wave of words. They went on about how Jeff the Killer was so hot, saying it with complete seriousness, as if they were talking about a real person they admired. Then one of them started talking about which Ninja Turtle they were, explaining it like it was an established fact of their identity. Another one jumped in with something about Pinkie Pie from My Little Pony. The conversation was chaotic, fast, and completely one-sided. I barely had time to respond, let alone contribute anything meaningful. Every time I tried to speak, one of them would cut me off or switch to another topic. What struck me the most wasn't just what they were talking about, but how they talked about it. They didn't frame these characters as stories or shows they enjoyed. They spoke about them like close friends, like people they knew personally, people they met regularly. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't fully explain at the time. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I thought maybe they were just really into fandoms. That wasn't unusual, especially at that age. Lots of kids get obsessed with fictional worlds, characters, and online communities. I had my own interests too, after all. But something about this felt different. It wasn't enthusiasm, it was intensity. As they kept talking, I felt increasingly uncomfortable. Not scared exactly, but deeply uneasy. There was a disconnect between how casual the situation should have been and how strange the interaction felt. My instincts were telling me that this wasn't a group of people I would ever really connect with. Eventually, I started to slowly back away. I didn't say much, just nodded along until there was a break in the noise and took that moment to create distance. As I walked away, a thought crossed my mind, simple and blunt. They're way too weird for me. That was it. That was the conclusion I reached. Not angry, not judgmental, just aware that whatever was going on with them didn't align with who I was or who I wanted to be around. After that, I never spoke to them again. I still saw them at the bus stop, still noticed them talking among themselves, but I kept my distance. Life went on. Days passed. Weeks turned into months. The bus stop remained just another part of the routine, something you barely think about as you count down the minutes until the bus arrives. Then the news broke. When word spread about what they had done, it hit like a punch to the chest. Everyone at the bus stop was completely stunned. People stood there in shock, trying to process what they were hearing. It didn't feel real at first. These were people we had been standing next to almost every school day for about a year. Potential murderers. That phrase didn't sit right in my mind. It didn't fit with the memory of awkward conversations and strange rambling about fictional characters. And yet, that was the reality. The idea that something so dark could exist so close, hidden in plain sight, was terrifying. None of us would have guessed they were capable of something like that. Not because we thought they were kind or trustworthy, but because the human brain struggles to accept that extreme violence can come from people who look ordinary, who stand beside you while waiting for a school bus. When the bus arrived that day, the mood was completely different from usual. There was no casual chatter, no laughter, no complaining about homework or teachers. Everyone boarded quietly, carrying the weight of what we had just learned. Once everyone was seated, something unexpected happened. The driver didn't pull away immediately. Instead, he parked the bus and stood up. He turned around to face us, and I'll never forget the look on his face. He looked serious, tense, and deeply disturbed. This wasn't the expression of someone enforcing a rule. It was the look of someone who had seen or heard something that shook them. He told us very firmly something along the lines of, "Shut up and do not say a word about what happened." His tone wasn't angry, but it was absolute. There was no room for argument or jokes. For a brief moment, the bus was completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Of course, being middle schoolers, total silence didn't last long. People started whispering to each other, leaning across seats, exchanging shocked comments in hushed voices. Even though the driver had told us not to talk, we couldn't help it. We were trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. Over time, as the shock wore off, the situation slowly transformed into something else. It became a topic people joked about, referenced in dark humor, turned into whispers and rumors that spread through the school. That kind of edgy humor is unfortunately common at that age, where kids don't fully grasp the weight of what they're joking about. At the time, I laughed along sometimes, not because it was funny, but because that's how people cope, especially when they're young and don't know how else to deal with fear. But as I got older, the humor faded. The story stayed with me, resurfacing every now and then when I least expected it. And with age came perspective. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I started asking myself questions I hadn't considered before. What if I had actually become friends with them? What if instead of walking away that day, I had stuck around longer, laughed along, tried to fit in? What if I had been drawn deeper into their world, their conversations, their mindset? Would I have been closer to them when everything happened? Would I have been the victim instead? Those thoughts are hard to sit with. There's no clear answer, and maybe that's for the best. But the realization that a single, small decision, choosing not to engage, choosing to walk away because something felt off, might have mattered, is chilling. That experience taught me something I didn't fully understand at the time. Sometimes your instincts pick up on things before your logic does. You don't always need a reason that makes sense on paper. Sometimes this feels wrong is reason enough. I didn't walk away because I thought they were dangerous. I walked away because they made me uncomfortable. And years later, knowing what they were capable of, that discomfort feels like a warning I was lucky enough to listen to. Even now, I still think about how close danger can be without announcing itself. How people who seem harmless, awkward, or strange can still carry something dark inside them, and how easily life can change based on a few seconds of interaction at a bus stop on an ordinary day. That thought has never really left me. Many years ago, a group of us went out drinking on a Friday night in a small town in Wales. It was the kind of place where everyone knows each other, where the pub is the center of social life, and where nights out usually follow the same familiar pattern. You meet up after work, have a few drinks, laugh too loudly, tell the same stories you've told a dozen times before, and eventually stumble out when the pub closes. There were 6 of us that night. We all lived in different places scattered around the countryside outside the village, so we had planned ahead. One of the lads had agreed to be the designated driver. He stayed sober, drank soft drinks all night, and made sure everyone knew he was fine to drive us home safely. It was something we'd done many times before, and there was nothing unusual about it. As the night went on, the mood was light. We were relaxed, joking around, enjoying ourselves. There was no tension, no arguments, nothing that hinted at what was coming. If anything, it felt like one of those nights you barely remember afterward because it was so ordinary. When the pub finally closed, we spilled out into the cool night air. The streets were quiet, the village almost completely still. We headed toward the car, laughing and pushing each other, ready to get home and sleep it off. That's when one of the lads said he didn't want to get in the car. He said he felt sick. Not violently ill, just nauseous, the kind of queasy feeling you sometimes get after drinking. He said he wanted some fresh air and thought a walk might help him clear his head. His house wasn't close, but it was within walking distance if you didn't mind the time. At first, everyone tried to convince him otherwise. It was late. It was dark. The roads were narrow and unlit. Getting in the car was the obvious choice. The driver was sober. It would be faster and safer, but he was firm. He said he really wanted to walk. As everyone was arguing with him, trying to change his mind, something strange happened to me. I felt this overwhelming, surreal sense that I needed to walk with him. It's hard to explain properly, even now. It wasn't a voice in my head, no words formed, no clear message. It was more like a sudden weight, an intense pull that came out of nowhere, a deep, instinctive urge that told me I should not get in that car, that I should follow him. The feeling was so strong that it caught me off guard. I wasn't scared, I wasn't anxious. I just knew in a way that didn't feel logical that I needed to walk. I remember standing there, listening to the others argue, while my mind was completely focused on that feeling. It didn't fade, it didn't weaken. If anything, it grew stronger the longer I stood there. I told the group I was going to walk too. That's when the protests really started. 4 of them tried to talk us out of it. They said we were being stupid. They said we could talk over the weekend. They said it made no sense to walk when there was a perfectly good ride available, but neither of us budged. Eventually, we agreed to catch up with them later, said our goodbyes, and watched as they got into the car. The engine started, the headlights came on, and they drove off down the road, disappearing into the darkness. We started walking. The night was quiet. The air felt cool and damp, the kind of chill that settles in after midnight. The road stretched out in front of us, narrow and winding, bordered by hedges and fields. There were no streetlights for long stretches, just the faint glow of the moon and the occasional distant house. As we walked, I asked my friend why he was so set on not getting in the car. I was curious, especially because of how strongly I had felt about walking myself. I wondered if he had felt something similar. He shrugged, casual as ever. Gut feeling, he said, just seemed like it was important to walk. That was it. No long explanation, no dramatic reason, just a feeling. We didn't talk much after that. We walked in comfortable silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I remember feeling oddly calm. The strange urgency I'd felt earlier had faded into a quiet sense of certainty, like I had made the right choice without knowing why. Eventually, we reached our homes and went to bed, tired and slightly drunk, with no idea that our lives had just split into 2 completely different paths. The next morning, I was woken up by my phone ringing. I could tell immediately from the sound of the voice on the other end that something was wrong. It was frantic, broken, struggling to get words out. My stomach dropped before I even understood what was being said. The car had crashed. Sometime during the night, on a country lane not far from the village, the car hit a wall. All 4 of our friends who were inside had been killed. There were no survivors. I don't remember much about the next few minutes after that call. Everything felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. My mind kept trying to reject what I'd heard, searching for a misunderstanding, a mistake, anything that would make it not true, but it was true. Later, we learned more details. The speedometer was stuck at over 100 miles per hour. At the time, that detail haunted me, though I later found out that a stuck speedometer doesn't necessarily reflect the speed at impact. Still, the image stayed with me. The loss was overwhelming. The other survivor and I were devastated. There's no better word for it. Shock, grief, disbelief, guilt, all of it hit at once, in waves that felt impossible to escape. We had lost 4 friends in a single night. People we had been laughing with just hours earlier were suddenly gone forever. What made it worse, in many ways, was the guilt. People tried to comfort us. They said things they thought were kind, things they probably believed would help. It just wasn't your time, they said. You were meant to survive. Someone was watching over you. I know they meant well, but those words didn't bring comfort. They made the weight heavier, because if it wasn't our time, what did that mean for the 4 who died? Why them and not us? Why did instinct save 2 lives and not 6? Those questions don't have answers. For a long time, I replayed that night over and over in my head. The moment at the car, the arguments, the feeling that came over me, the choice to walk. I wondered what would have happened if I had ignored that feeling, if I had laughed it off and gotten in the car like everyone expected me to. The truth is simple and terrifying. I wouldn't be here. That realization changed me. To this day, I listen to my instincts in almost everything I do. I don't ignore that quiet pull anymore. I don't brush off gut feelings just because they don't make logical sense in the moment. I've learned that instinct doesn't always come with explanations, and it doesn't ask permission. I still can't explain why I felt what I felt that night. I can't explain where it came from or why it appeared so suddenly. What I do know is that the feeling didn't come until my friend said he was going to walk. It was like something clicked into place the moment he made that decision. A combination of his instinct and mine saved my life. That knowledge stays with me. It's not comforting exactly, but it's grounding. It reminds me that sometimes survival comes down to moments we barely notice at the time. A choice that seems small, a decision that feels strange, a step taken in a different direction for no clear reason. I don't romanticize it. I don't see it as fate or destiny in some neat, reassuring way. What happened was tragic and unfair, and nothing about it feels balanced or just. But I am still here. And every time I feel that quiet, insistent tug telling me to pause, to wait, to walk instead of ride, I'd listen. Because once in my life, listening made all the difference. There was a story not too long ago that stayed with me long after I first heard it. It wasn't a ghost story or something supernatural, but it was horrifying in a very real, very modern way. It was about an innocent man who lost his life because of something called swatting, and the sheer stupidity and cruelty behind it made the entire situation feel almost impossible to accept. For anyone who isn't familiar with the term, swatting is when someone makes a false report to the police, usually claiming a serious violent crime is taking place, in order to get a heavily armed police response sent to a specific address. The goal is to have SWAT teams or large groups of officers storm a location under the belief that lives are in immediate danger. It's done as a prank, an act of revenge, or simply for entertainment, but it is incredibly dangerous. People can and do get hurt or killed because of it. This particular case started in the most ridiculous way imaginable. Two people were playing Call of Duty online. It wasn't some major tournament or high-stakes competition. It was just an online match, the kind millions of people play every day. During the game, a small bet was made. The loser owed the winner $1.50. That was it. Not a large amount of money. Not something that would ruin anyone financially. Just a trivial sum. The person who lost the match didn't want to pay. Instead of accepting the loss or simply ignoring it, he decided to escalate the situation in the worst way possible. He chose to hire someone to swat the person he lost to. Over $1.50, he decided to put someone's life at risk. He contacted a known swatter and gave him the gamer tag of the person he wanted targeted. From there, the swatter reached out directly to the gamer through Twitter, trying to get his home address. The swatter needed a location to send the police to. At this point, the gamer realized something wasn't right. He knew what swatting was and understood the danger. Rather than give out his real address, he decided to protect himself by giving the swatter the address of a house he no longer lived in. That house, however, was no longer empty. Someone else lived there now. That decision, made in an attempt to stay safe, unknowingly placed another person in danger. Using the address he was given, the swatter contacted local police. He made an extremely serious false report. He claimed that his father had been murdered, and that he and his family were being held hostage inside the house. This is the kind of call that immediately triggers a massive law enforcement response. Police are trained to act quickly and decisively in situations like that because lives are supposedly on the line. As a result, a large number of police officers and SWAT team members were dispatched to the address. The person who lived there was a 29-year-old man named Andrew Finch. He had absolutely nothing to do with the online argument, the game, or the swatting call. He was at home, on his own property, completely unaware that his house had been turned into the center of a fabricated hostage situation. Police arrived in force. Lights, sirens, weapons drawn. Officers surrounded the house and ordered Andrew to come outside. Imagine the confusion and fear of being in that situation. One moment you're at home, and the next you're being confronted by heavily armed police telling you that you are suspected of a violent crime you know nothing about. Andrew complied. He walked outside as instructed. He followed commands. At some point, his arms were lowered, and in that moment, officers fired. Andrew was shot and killed on his own property. He never posed a threat. He never committed a crime. He was an innocent man who happened to live at an address someone used for a cruel and reckless prank. The absurdity of the situation is difficult to comprehend. A human being lost his life because someone didn't want to pay $1.50. Not because of personal hatred, not because of a long-standing feud, but because of pettiness and ego in an online video game. The news shocked people across the country. As more details came out, the full scope of the situation became even more disturbing. The swatter involved was not new to this behavior. He had carried out similar attacks many times before, targeting people across multiple states. This wasn't a one-time mistake or lapse in judgment. It was a pattern of deliberate actions that repeatedly put innocent people at risk. The swatter was later identified as Tyler Barris, a 25-year-old man. He was eventually charged with dozens of felonies across several states due to his history of swatting incidents. The scale of the charges reflected how serious and widespread his actions had been. But no amount of charges could undo what happened to Andrew Finch. Andrew was 29 years old. He had a life, relationships, routines, plans for the future. All of that ended because of a lie told over the phone. His family lost a son, a brother, a loved one. They didn't just lose him to violence. They lost him to something senseless, something that never should have happened. What makes the story even harder to sit with is how modern and preventable it feels. Swatting exists because of anonymity, because of how easily people can hide behind screens and fake identities. It exists because technology allows someone to reach emergency services from anywhere and lie convincingly enough to trigger armed responses. This case forced many people to confront uncomfortable questions. How should police respond to emergency calls in the digital age? How do you balance rapid response with caution? How do you prevent malicious actors from abusing systems designed to protect people? For gamers and online communities, the story hit especially hard. Trash talk, arguments, and rivalries are common in competitive games. Most people see them as harmless. But this case showed how easily those conflicts can spill into real life with devastating consequences. The gamer who originally gave the address never intended for anyone to be harmed. He thought he was avoiding danger by not giving out his real location. But even that act of self-protection became part of a chain reaction that led to tragedy. It's a painful reminder that once something like swatting is set in motion, it becomes uncontrollable. Andrew Finch didn't know any of this. He never agreed to be part of it. He simply answered his door. When people talk about this case now, there's often a moment of silence, a pause where the weight of it sinks in. The idea that your life can be ended not because of something you did, but because of a lie told by a stranger hundreds of miles away, is deeply unsettling. The phrase, "wrong place at the wrong time," doesn't even begin to cover it. At its core, this was a tragedy, caused by irresponsibility, cruelty, and the failure to understand the real-world consequences of online actions. It's a reminder that emergency systems are not toys, and that pranks involving police responses are never harmless. Andrew Finch should still be alive. Instead, his name is now forever tied to a cautionary story about swatting, about online behavior, and about how fragile the line between virtual conflict and real-world violence can be. It's a story that continues to circulate not because people enjoy hearing it, but because it serves as a stark warning of what can happen when empathy disappears behind a screen. In the end, it's not just a story about swatting. It's a story about how easily human life can be lost when systems built to protect are manipulated, and when people forget that there are real lives on the other end of their actions. And all of it started over $1.50. Chris Kramers and Lisanne Froon arrived in Panama on March 15, 2014, at the start of what was meant to be a 6-week vacation. Both were young Dutch women, full of energy and excitement, eager to explore a new country together. Their plan was a mix of travel, adventure, and volunteer work, something many young travelers dream of doing before settling into the routines of adult life. For the first 2 weeks, they traveled around Panama, visiting different areas and experiencing the culture. Everything appeared normal and well documented. They took photos, posted updates, and stayed in touch with their families back home. There was no indication that anything was wrong or that the trip would take a dark turn. On March 29th, they arrived in the small mountain town of Boquete. The town sits near the Baru volcano and is surrounded by dense cloud forests and lush greenery. It's a popular spot for hikers, backpackers, and travelers looking for a quieter, more scenic experience. Chris and Lisanne planned to stay there for about a month, living with a local family while volunteering with children. They seemed happy and settled. They explored the town, made plans for volunteer work, and continued sending daily messages to their families, something that reassured everyone back home. Their communication was consistent, cheerful, and routine. On April 1st, the two women decided to go hiking. Around 11 in the morning, they set out with their host's dog to explore the trails near Boquete. The area around the Baru volcano is known for its cloud forests, where mist often hangs low and visibility can change quickly. It's beautiful but also unpredictable. It is believed they may have taken the Pianista Trail, a path that starts relatively easy and well-traveled, but becomes more rugged and remote the farther one goes. Earlier that day, they had posted on Facebook that they intended to walk around Boquete. It was also reported that they had been seen having brunch with 2 young Dutch men before beginning their hike, though those men were not with them on the trail. Nothing about that morning seemed unusual. They were dressed casually, carried a backpack, phones, and a camera, and set off as many tourists do, expecting to return later that afternoon. As evening approached, concern began to grow. The hosts noticed that their dog had returned home alone. The animal had gone with the women that morning, and its return without them was immediately alarming. At the same time, Lisanne's parents stopped receiving the daily text messages they had grown accustomed to. Silence replaced the steady updates. The following morning, April 2nd, Chris and Lisanne missed an appointment they had scheduled with a local guide. This confirmed that something was wrong. By April 3rd, authorities were notified, and aerial searches of the forest began. Local residents joined in, walking trails and searching areas near the town. On April 6th, the situation escalated. The parents of both women flew to Panama, accompanied by Dutch police, dog units, and detectives. A full-scale search of the surrounding forests began and continued for 10 days. The terrain was difficult, the vegetation thick, and the weather unpredictable. Despite extensive efforts, there was no sign of the women. Their families, desperate for answers, offered a reward of $30,000 for information leading to their discovery. Weeks passed with no breakthroughs. Then, 10 weeks after the disappearance, a local woman made a discovery that changed everything. She turned in a blue backpack belonging to Lisanne Froon. She claimed she had found it in a rice paddy along a riverbank near her village of Alto Romero. located in the Bocas del Toro region. What raised eyebrows immediately was her statement that she was sure the backpack had not been there the day before. The backpack itself was in remarkably good condition. Inside were 2 pairs of sunglasses, $83 in cash, Lisanne's passport, a water bottle, Lisanne's camera, 2 bras, and both women's phones. Everything was dry, clean, and neatly packed, as if it had been placed there intentionally rather than left exposed to the elements for weeks. The discovery of the phones revealed disturbing details. Phone records showed that just hours after the women began their hike, emergency calls had been attempted. The first call was made from Chris's iPhone at 16:39. 12 minutes later, at 16:51, Lisanne's Samsung Galaxy attempted to call for help as well. They tried both 112, the international emergency number, and 911, Panama's emergency number. None of these calls connected due to lack of reception in the area. Only one attempt, made on April 3rd, briefly connected for just over a second before cutting out. As the days passed, the phone activity painted a picture of growing desperation. After April 5th, Lisanne's phone battery was completely drained and never turned on again. Chris's iPhone continued to be switched on intermittently, likely in attempts to find reception. After April 6th, something troubling appeared in the phone data. Multiple incorrect PIN codes were entered into the iPhone. The correct code was never entered again. Between April 7th and April 10th, there were 77 attempts to make emergency calls using the iPhone. None succeeded. On April 11th, the iPhone was turned on at 10:51 in the morning and turned off for the final time at 11:56. After that, there was no more activity. Lisanne's camera added another unsettling layer to the mystery. Photos taken on April 1st showed the women hiking, smiling, and appearing calm. The images suggested they had crossed the Continental Divide and wandered deeper into wilderness areas beyond the main trail. There were no signs of panic, injury, or distress in those early photos. Then came the photos from April 8th, between 1 and 4 a.m. in the morning. 90 flash photos were taken in near complete darkness. The images were chaotic and difficult to interpret. Some appeared to show a river or ravine. Others showed close-ups of rocks, branches, and the forest floor. One photo showed a twig arranged with plastic bags and candy wrappers, placed on top of a rock, as if marking a location. Another showed what looked like toilet paper and a mirror on a rock. One image captured the back of Chris Kremers's head, with what appeared to be blood near her temple. Why the photos were taken and what they were meant to document remains unknown. The timing, the darkness, and the lack of clarity only deepened the mystery. Following the discovery of the backpack, search efforts shifted to areas along the Culebra River. Soon after, Chris's jean shorts were found on a rock on the opposite bank of a tributary several kilometers from where the backpack had been located. Reports initially stated that the shorts were neatly folded and zipped, though later witnesses claimed they had been found in the river itself. 2 months later, closer to the location of the backpack, human remains were discovered. A pelvis and a boot containing a foot were found along the riverbank. Over time, at least 33 bones were recovered, scattered across the same area. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon. The condition of the bones raised more questions. Some of Lisanne's bones still had skin attached to them, while Chris's bones appeared bleached. A Panamanian forensic anthropologist later stated that under magnification there were no visible scratches or marks on the bones. There was no evidence of animal bites, tool marks, or trauma of any kind. No clear cause of death was ever established. The official conclusion suggested the women likely became lost, injured, and eventually succumbed to the harsh environment. But many questions remain unanswered. The emergency calls, the incorrect PIN entries, the nighttime photographs. The condition and placement of their belongings. And the state of the remains continue to fuel debate. To this day, the disappearance and deaths of Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon remain one of the most unsettling modern mysteries involving travelers. It is a case that blurs the line between tragic accident and unanswered questions, leaving behind fragments of evidence that tell parts of a story, but never the whole thing. What began as a hopeful journey ended deep in the Panamanian jungle, leaving behind silence, photographs taken in darkness, and a trail of unanswered questions that still haunt those who try to understand what truly happened. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. A while back, a few friends and I decided to climb a mountain that sat out in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a well-known place or a tourist spot, just one of those locations locals talk about but don't really go to. We were teenagers, bored, restless, and convinced that anything remote automatically meant adventure. One of my friends drove us there in her car, and at the time, none of us thought much about the risks. It was mid-May, a time of year when everything should feel alive. Trees were supposed to be green, bugs loud, birds everywhere. The day had started normally enough, but as we drove and began climbing higher, something felt off. The sun was setting much faster than it should have. It was only around 5 in the evening, and yet the light was fading rapidly, as if someone was dimming the world. At first, we joked about it. Maybe the mountain blocked the sun earlier. Maybe we were just imagining things. Still, the sky darkened in a way that didn't match the time of day, and an uneasy feeling settled in my chest that I couldn't explain. Eventually, we reached the top. At the summit, we stopped near an old house with a barn beside it. From the outside, it already looked abandoned. The wood was weathered, the paint long gone, and the entire place had that forgotten, neglected look that comes from years of exposure to the elements. That alone would have been unsettling, but what we found inside made it far worse. When we stepped into the house, it looked like someone had just stepped out for a quick errand and never came back. There was uncapped soap sitting by the sink. Beds inside were made, neat and untouched. Food containers were still on the counter. A cutting board sat out with a knife resting on it, as if someone had been in the middle of preparing a meal. Nothing looked looted or vandalized. It didn't look like decay had slowly taken over, it looked paused. That feeling intensified when we realized the house clearly hadn't been occupied in years. A massive hornet's nest clung to one of the doors, abandoned and layered thickly enough to suggest it had been there a long time. Dust coated everything. The contradiction made my stomach twist. How could something look so lived in and yet so completely abandoned? The barn next to the house added another layer of unease. On its door was red writing, scratched aggressively into the wood. Whatever message had once been there was no longer readable. Someone had tried to erase it by clawing at it until the words were reduced to nothing but scars in the surface. The effort behind that alone felt disturbing. When we finally stepped away from the car and stood still, something else hit us all at once. The silence. There was absolutely nothing. No birds calling, no insects buzzing, no wind moving through trees. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was the kind that presses in on your ears, the kind that feels wrong because nature itself seems to be holding its breath. We all noticed it at the same time, exchanging glances without saying anything. But we were teenagers, and teenagers are famously bad at listening to instincts. Behind the house stretched an old blueberry field, or at least it used to be one. We decided to walk out into it, partly out of curiosity and partly because none of us wanted to admit we were already uncomfortable. The field was completely dead. Every other plant around us was green, budding, alive with spring growth. But this field was nothing but brittle stems and dead leaves. No color. No signs of life at all. As we walked farther into the field, the sun continued sinking lower, faster than it should have. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air felt heavy. That sense of being watched crept in slowly, settling over us like a fog. Our joking stopped. Our voices dropped. Anxiety took over without any of us needing to say it out loud. That was when we finally made the smartest decision of the entire night, decided to leave. We turned back toward the car quickly, not running but not lingering either. The relief of heading back was immediate, but it didn't last long. When we reached the car and tried to start it, nothing happened. Not a sputter, not a click. Absolute silence. That alone would have been stressful, but what made it worse was that the car shouldn't have had any issues. My friend had recently gotten several things repaired and replaced, including the battery. There was no reason for it to be completely dead. Panic began to rise. We did the only thing that made sense. We called our parents to explain where we were and what was happening, then contacted the LA to send a tow truck. Looking back now, something about that moment still chills me. Out of all of us, my phone was the only one with service. At the time, it just felt lucky. Now it feels unsettling. As we waited, the darkness settled in fully. The uncomfortable feelings intensified. Every sound, every movement of shadow made my heart race. The house and barn loomed nearby, barely visible now, like shapes waiting to be noticed. Eventually, Palale contacted us to say they wouldn't be able to reach us and that they were sending another truck. That truck also refused to come. With every passing minute, the situation felt more wrong. Isolation pressed in. The silence deepened. We realized no help was coming. Finally, we called my friend's mom. When she arrived, relief washed over us so strongly it almost made me dizzy. We grabbed our things and hurried toward the minivan. As we were moving, my friend suddenly froze and turned back toward her car. She asked, quietly but urgently, "Is there someone in my car?" I turned to look. At that exact moment, every light inside the car turned on. Then, just as suddenly, they turned off again. Immediately after, all the doors locked. My blood ran cold. The car did not have automatic locking doors. And even if it somehow did, my friend had just realized her keys were still inside the car. There was no logical explanation for what we had just seen. We didn't wait. We rushed into the van, slammed the doors, and left as fast as we could. As we drove down the mountain, none of us spoke. None of us looked out the windows. We kept our heads down, focused on each other, afraid that if we acknowledged what was around us, it might acknowledge us back. We all went home that night, but none of us slept. Every light stayed on, every noise felt threatening. The fear didn't fade when we reached safety. It followed us. Later, when the car was finally brought down and taken to a mechanic, it started instantly. No hesitation, no issues. The mechanics couldn't find anything wrong. No electrical failure, no battery problem, nothing that could explain what had happened. What made it worse was what came afterward. My friend was later dragged back up to the mountain by other people. When she returned, she said there was new writing on the barn, writing she didn't recognize. She guessed it was Latin. It has been over a year since that night, but it still affects me. Maybe the story doesn't sound terrifying to everyone. There were no monsters, no clear explanation, no dramatic confrontation. But that's what makes it worse. The fear came from the environment, from the silence, from the feeling that something was deeply wrong without knowing why. To this day, it's the most terrifying experience I've ever had. Not because of what we saw, but because of what we felt. That sense that we were somewhere we weren't meant to be, and that leaving when we did might have been the only reason we ever got the chance to leave at all. I learned to hunt on my family's farm in Iowa, where hunting wasn't something you casually picked up later in life. It was part of how you grew up. From a young age, I helped build tree stands by hand, hauling lumber through fields and along tree-lined creeks, placing them where deer naturally moved. Those creeks were everything. They provided cover, water, and predictable travel paths. If you understood how animals moved along them, you had an advantage. My dad was absolutely firm about one rule above all others. You did not walk to your hunting spot when it was legal to hunt. You got there hours before. Deer movement happened at dusk and at dawn, and if you were crunching leaves or breaking sticks during those times, you were already doing it wrong. You were supposed to be settled in, quiet, and part of the woods long before the animals started moving. That lesson was drilled into me so deeply that it became instinct. I carried that knowledge with me as I got older, and it served me well. I usually had decent success, not because I was some exceptional hunter, but because I respected preparation and timing. I trusted the routine and the patience it required. As a young adult, I moved to Georgia. It was a big change from Iowa in almost every way, including the land itself. The terrain was thicker, greener, more tangled. After settling in, I decided to go hunting in one of the massive wildlife management areas in the state. These places are enormous, the kind of land where you can walk for hours and feel like you've barely scratched the surface. Before hunting, I went out to scout. I did what I had always done, walking the area during the day, paying attention to water, trails, and terrain. During that scouting trip, I found a small river running near a gravel road. Vehicles weren't allowed on that road, which immediately made it appealing. Less traffic usually means less human disturbance, and that often means better animal movement. I followed the river for a while and figured I would come back that weekend and pick a spot along the creek. I tied a ribbon on a tree to mark where I planned to leave the road and drop down toward the water. Everything felt straightforward and familiar. On the morning of the hunt, I parked in the designated lot and started walking toward the spot I had chosen. It was around 2 in the morning. I used my flashlight sparingly, clicking it on only when I needed to make sure I was still on the road. Even though I had scouted the area in daylight, it looked completely different at that hour. Shapes felt distorted, distances felt longer. The woods swallowed sound in a way that made everything feel closer and farther at the same time. After about 30 minutes of hiking down the gravel road, I saw what I thought was the ribbon I had tied earlier. Seeing it was reassuring. It meant I hadn't missed my mark. I turned off the road and carefully made my way down the slope toward the river. As I reached the bottom, I noticed a stacked stone area that immediately stood out. It was almost perfect. 3 sides of stone forming a natural enclosure, with an open front facing the direction deer would likely travel. It looked like a ready-made ground blind. You couldn't design something better if you tried. I quietly set up there and settled in. The air was damp and cool. The woods felt heavy but alive. For hours, I could hear movement. Deer and other animals moving between me and the river. Leaves rustling. Footsteps brushing through undergrowth. It was constant, and it made me confident. I remember thinking that this was exactly what you hope for when you hunt. Everything felt right. As the sky slowly began to lighten and my eyes adjusted enough to start picking out details, the sounds of deer moved farther away. That didn't concern me. I knew that once daylight arrived, movement often slowed and became more scattered. It was just becoming legal hunting hours, and I settled into the waiting game, prepared to sit as long as needed. With more light came more awareness of my surroundings. I began to notice that the ground around me was completely trampled and muddy. The undergrowth had been mashed down by footprints, leaving bare earth exposed. The stone area I was sitting in was about 8 feet by 8 feet, almost like a small grotto. It didn't feel random anymore, it felt used. Then I noticed something near my feet. There was a strip of yellow plastic partially buried in the mud. At first I didn't think much of it. It looked exactly like the material we used back home when I worked as a lineman. We always called it caution tape. It was dirty, flattened, and looked like it had been there a while. I glanced behind me and thought maybe this stone area had been marked as unsafe at some point, maybe unstable or collapsing. But the tape wasn't stretched or tied to anything. It was just lying there, mostly covered in mud, and I wasn't inside a structure anyway. Even if something shifted, I figured I'd be fine. So I ignored it. I stayed there for several more hours. Eventually, probably around 7 or 8 in the morning, I decided it was time to move. The woods had gone quiet, and I figured I might find a better location farther along the creek. I gathered my gear carefully and made my way back up toward the gravel road. On the way up, I noticed a narrow path I hadn't seen earlier in the dark. It led me back to the road more directly. As soon as I stepped onto the gravel, something off to the side caught my eye. There was a large pile of items lying near the road. They were soaked from rain, darkened, and heavy. As I got closer, my stomach tightened. They were stuffed animals, small toys, handmade signs, notes, trinkets. Everything looked like it had been placed there intentionally, but weather and time had taken their toll. The colors had bled. Marker ink ran down the paper. Most of the writing was unreadable, except for one note. That one was still clear enough to read. It was a memorial for a young boy. The note explained that he had been murdered in those woods, and that his body had been found there. The realization hit me slowly at first, then all at once. It washed over me like a wave of heat, heavy and overwhelming. My mind raced backward through the morning, replaying everything. The yellow plastic strip wasn't caution tape, it was police tape. Police line, do not cross. The stone grotto where I had been sitting for hours wasn't just a convenient natural blind. It was the exact spot where a child's body had been found. I stood there, frozen. A full-body shiver ran through me, intense and uncontrollable, lasting a good 15 seconds. It wasn't the sharp fear of immediate danger. It was something deeper, a crushing awareness of where I had been, of what had happened there, of how unknowingly close I had been to something unimaginably tragic. All the details from earlier suddenly felt different. The silence in the woods, the trampled ground, the unnatural stillness. Even the way the area had felt heavy and watchful in the dark took on a new meaning. I didn't linger. I left quietly, carrying that knowledge with me. Even now, thinking about it makes me pause. It makes me quiet. It's not a story I tell casually. I wasn't frightened in the way people usually think of fear, but the weight of it settled into me afterward and never really left. When I think back on that hunt, I don't remember the planning or the early morning hike. I remember the realization, the slow understanding that crept over me and then hit all at once. The knowledge that the woods don't just hold animals and trails, they hold memories, sometimes terrible ones. Knowing that I sat there unknowingly for hours in that exact place still sends a chill through me every single time. I grew up in a small town in Washington State, not far from the Oregon border and relatively close to Portland, but still surrounded by massive stretches of evergreen forest. It was the kind of place where trees seemed endless and the woods always felt close, even when you were standing in the middle of town. The town itself was small in a way that's hard to explain to people who didn't grow up like that. You knew everyone, not just faces, but names. First and last names. The kids you sat next to in kindergarten were the same people you walked across the stage with at graduation. There were no strangers, only familiar people you hadn't talked to yet. Because of where we lived, the forest was always part of our lives. We grew up hiking, messing around on trails, building forts, and hearing stories about what might be out there. Some of those stories were jokes, some were local legends, and some were the kind of things adults talked about quietly when they thought kids weren't listening. The woods were beautiful, but they were also big enough to feel intimidating if you really thought about it. When we were sophomores in high school, a group of us decided it would be a great idea to go on a minimalist camping trip. We were teenagers full of confidence and not much sense. The idea was to pack light, hike deep into the woods, and camp somewhere truly remote. No established campground, no facilities, no other people around. Just us, our gear, and the forest. We used Google Earth to scout a location. We zoomed in and out, looking for a spot that seemed far from roads and towns. Eventually, we picked a place that looked perfect. It was about 20 miles from the closest road, surrounded by dense forest in every direction. At the time, that distance felt exciting, like proof that we were doing something bold. We didn't think much about what it actually meant to be that far from help. We packed our bags, loaded into our cars, and drove out toward the area. Southwest Washington can feel like true wilderness once you get off the main highways. Roads narrow, pavement turns to dirt, and cell service disappears without warning. As we drove deeper and deeper, everything felt more isolated. About 10 miles down a dirt road, we passed a sign that caught our attention. It read, "Property patrolled by armed guards." We all laughed. To us, it sounded dramatic, like something a paranoid landowner would put up to scare people away. We joked about some hermit living out there who didn't want company. Instead of turning around, we decided to drive a while past the sign so we wouldn't bother whoever owned the land. Eventually, we parked the cars, unloaded our gear, and got ready to hike. By this point, we were incredibly far from anything familiar. Later, we estimated we were nearly 100 miles from the closest post office. At the time, that detail didn't scare us. It just made us feel tougher, more adventurous. We started hiking, did packs on our backs, joking loudly and laughing about everything. Like most teenagers, we filled the silence with nonsense. We made jokes about Sasquatch, pretending every snapped twig was proof that something was watching us. None of us truly believed it, but it was part of the fun. The forest felt endless, tall trees blocking out the sky, the ground covered in moss and fallen needles. After walking about half the distance, roughly 10 miles in, everything changed. We came across something that stopped us in our tracks. Stretching through the forest ahead of us was a brand new chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. It wasn't rusted or old. It looked recently installed, clean and out of place among the ancient trees. The fence didn't run straight. It weaved between massive old-growth trunks, carefully placed as if someone had taken great effort to build it without disturbing the forest too much. The joking stopped instantly. We stood there in silence, staring at it. There was nothing else around. No buildings, no signs, no explanation. Just this fence cutting through the wilderness where, according to our maps, nothing should have existed. None of us wanted to be the first to say it was creepy. We were teenage boys, too proud to admit fear out loud. After a moment of awkward silence, we agreed to keep going. The fence wasn't blocking our path directly, and we convinced ourselves it was probably nothing important. Maybe it marked some forgotten boundary. Maybe it belonged to logging land or a private reserve. Not even 2 minutes after moving past the fence, we heard a sound. It was hard to describe. It wasn't an animal call we recognized. It wasn't wind. It sounded like humming, but not musical. Random, uneven, without any clear rhythm or tune. It came from ahead of us, somewhere between the trees. Our bravado vanished. We pulled out our knives like we had any idea what we were doing, which in hindsight was ridiculous. We froze where we stood, listening. The forest felt heavier, quieter, like everything else had gone still to make room for that sound. Then we saw him. About 20 yards ahead of us stood a boy we recognized immediately. His name was Sean. He was our age, someone we had grown up with, gone to school with our entire lives. Sean had a form of autism and was known around town. People looked out for him. He wasn't someone who would normally be wandering alone deep in the forest. He was standing by a young pine tree, touching it with his hands. He wasn't doing anything aggressive or frantic, just touching the trunk slowly, almost gently. The humming sound stopped. We called out to him, "Sean! Sean!" He didn't turn around. He didn't look at us at all, even though it was obvious he heard us. After a moment, he walked in a slow circle around the tree, then turned and began walking deeper into the forest. His movement was strange, not hurried, not cautious, almost aimless, like he was being guided by something only he could sense. We followed him. At first, we tried to call out again, but he didn't respond. We kept him in sight as best we could, weaving through trees and undergrowth. Then suddenly, we ran straight into the fence again. There was no gate, no opening, no break in the wire. The fence was solid, unbroken, and impossible to pass through without cutting it. We stopped abruptly, confused and breathing hard. Sean was nowhere to be seen. It was as if he had walked straight through the barrier or vanished into the trees beyond it. We stood there, staring at the fence, trying to understand what we had just seen. Our maps hadn't shown any property lines. There were no houses, no facilities, nothing marked anywhere near where Sean had walked. Even later, when we checked Google Earth again and again, we couldn't find anything that explained that fence or where it led. Eventually, fear set in properly. This wasn't funny anymore. This wasn't an adventure story we'd tell later with laughter. We were deep in the woods, far from help, confronted with something that didn't make sense. We made the decision to turn back. No one argued. The hike back felt longer than the hike in. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow between trees looked like it might move. The forest felt different now, less welcoming, more watchful. We didn't joke about Sasquatch anymore. We barely talked at all. We made it back to the cars without incident, but the feeling followed us. The sense that we had seen something we weren't meant to see, or crossed some invisible line without realizing it. To this day, none of us can explain what happened to Sean that day. We don't know how he got there, why he was there, or how he disappeared beyond that fence. We can't find any record of a house, a facility, or even a clear property boundary in that area. The fence remains a mystery, as does whatever lay beyond it. As I've gotten older, I've thought about that day many times, about how confident and careless we were, about how the forest can hide things in plain sight, and about how sometimes the most unsettling experiences aren't loud or violent, but quiet, confusing, and impossible to explain. Even now, when I think about that chain-link fence winding through ancient trees, or the way Sean walked away without looking back, I feel that same tightness in my chest. It's the feeling of knowing you brushed up against something unknown, something just outside your understanding, and that feeling has never fully gone away. I grew up believing that truly horrifying things happened far away from you, to other people in other places. I never thought I would come so close to something violent and senseless, let alone brush past both the person who would be killed and the person who would kill him. But one night, in a completely ordinary place, that illusion disappeared forever. This happened in 1994 in Anchorage, Alaska. At the time, I was young, just living my life, doing normal things with friends, never imagining that an ordinary stop for coffee would turn into something that stayed with me for decades. That night, a friend and I were at a local coffee shop. It wasn't a bar or a sketchy place, just a normal spot people went to hang out, talk, and relax. We were waiting to use the bathroom. There was only one restroom and someone was already inside. It was taking a while, but neither of us thought much of it at first. Places like that are always busy, and sometimes you just have to wait. While we stood there, a man started talking to us. He said he was waiting for his friend who was inside the bathroom. He immediately gave off a strange energy, not aggressive exactly, but off. He seemed a little tipsy, maybe drunk, and he was trying too hard to engage us. At one point, he started asking to see our driver's licenses. He said he didn't believe we weren't 21. The way he said it didn't feel official or playful, just intrusive. We laughed it off at first, assuming he was just being weird or trying to flirt. We told him no, that we weren't showing him anything. Instead of backing off, he pushed harder. He kept insisting, kept questioning us, and then actually pulled out his own license to show us. That moment stuck with me more than I realized at the time. His name registered in my head because everything about him felt wrong. The way he spoke, the way he watched us, the way he ignored our discomfort. It wasn't just annoying, it was unsettling. Finally, the bathroom door opened. The man who stepped out looked completely different from the one who had been talking to us. He was barely able to stand. He looked drunk in a way that was more than casual intoxication. He was unsteady, pale, and disoriented. Instead of leaving the bathroom, he turned right back around toward the sink. I remember thinking how badly I needed to pee. I was uncomfortable, but I also assessed the situation quickly. My friend was right outside. The main counter of the coffee shop was nearby. The man could barely keep his balance. I figured I could use the bathroom quickly, keep an eye on him, and leave without any trouble. So I went in. The bathroom was small, and the state of it immediately told me how drunk he really was. The toilet seat was splattered with pinkish urine. I had to wipe it down myself. I didn't sit. I hovered, trying to be quick. While staying aware of everything happening around me, the man was at the sink, fumbling with his hands, trying to wash them, but not really succeeding. He didn't speak to me. He didn't approach me. At one point, he looked over and gave me a goofy, unsteady smile. That was it. No words, no movement toward me, just that smile. I finished as fast as I could and left the bathroom. Outside, my friend looked shaken. She told me that while I was inside, the man with the license had gotten even pushier. He kept asking where she lived. He wouldn't drop the license thing. He was standing too close. At that point, both of us felt uncomfortable enough that we decided to leave the area and go back to the larger group of friends we had come with. We brushed it off as a weird encounter, unpleasant, but nothing more. People like that exist everywhere, or so we thought. Not long after, we learned the truth. After leaving the coffee shop, the man who had been in the bathroom was murdered. The person who killed him was the same man who had been showing us his license. The man who had just met him. The man who had been asking us invasive questions and refusing to take no for an answer. We were likely the last people to see the victim alive. That realization hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, every detail replayed itself in my mind. The drunk man barely able to stand. The strange calmness of the other man. The way he fixated on us. The insistence, the questions, the license, the name. It occurred to us later that the man with the license may have been looking at us as potential victims. The thought still makes my stomach turn. If circumstances had been slightly different, if we had been alone, if we had engaged him more, if we had gone somewhere else, what would have happened? Later, we learned that when questioned by police, the killer said he had an irresistible impulse to kill someone. That phrase has stayed with me ever since. The idea that someone could walk into a public place, talk casually to strangers, and be carrying that kind of urge inside them is terrifying. The killer's name was Ray E. Rice. The victim never had a chance. For a long time after that, I couldn't stop thinking about the man who was killed. I remembered how drunk he was, how vulnerable, how he could barely stand. I kept wondering if I should have done something, if I should have helped him, if I should have made sure he got home safely, if I could have said something to someone, anyone, that might have changed what happened next. Guilt has a way of rewriting memories. It tells you that you should have known, should have acted, should have seen the future. But the truth is, at the time, I didn't know. I couldn't have known. None of us could. Still, that knowledge doesn't erase the feeling. It messed me up for a while. I became hyper-aware of people's behavior, of vibes, of small details. I learned that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it stands in front of you, smiling, holding out a driver's license, pretending to be friendly. What haunts me most is that despite how bad my memory usually is, I remember exactly what both men looked like. Their faces are burned into my mind in a way that ordinary memories aren't. I can still see them clearly, even now, decades later. That night taught me something I wish I had never learned so personally. Violence doesn't always come from rage or chaos. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as casual conversation, hidden behind small talk and social norms. And sometimes you don't realize how close you were to it until it's already too late. I still think about that man in the bathroom, about how helpless he looked, about how ordinary his night probably felt until it wasn't, and about how a single encounter in a coffee shop can ripple outward into tragedy. It stays with me. It always will. I was living in an apartment at the time, one of those places that technically had a small grassy area outside, but wasn't really useful for anything. It was just a patch of grass, more decorative than practical. My dog, a stubborn little beagle, refused to use it. No matter how long I stood there or how late it was, he wouldn't do his business there. Because of that, every night I had to walk him a little way through the neighborhood. It was a quiet area, mostly houses and a few apartment buildings. Nothing fancy, nothing obviously dangerous. I had lived there long enough to feel comfortable. I knew the streets, recognized a few neighbors, and had never had any real problems. Walking my dog at night was just part of my routine. One night, I took him out around 8 in the evening. It wasn't very late, but it was already dark. The streetlights were on, casting that yellowish glow that makes everything feel half asleep. I had only walked about 2 houses down the street when I felt something change. There was no sound, no clear reason, just a sudden sharp feeling in my stomach that something was wrong. I stopped and turned around. Right behind me was a man. He was close, much closer than he should have been. He had his jacket hood pulled up, and his face was mostly in shadow. What scared me the most wasn't just that he was there, but how quiet he had been. My dog hadn't reacted at all. No barking, no pulling on the leash, nothing. It was like the man had appeared out of nowhere. For a split second, we just looked at each other. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I turned around and ran. I pulled my dog along with me, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't scream. I didn't think. I just ran straight back toward my apartment. As I rounded the corner to my building, I glanced back. He was still standing there, watching me. He didn't chase me. He didn't shout. He just stood there, still and quiet, staring. In that moment, a terrifying realization hit me. He now knew exactly where I lived. I got inside, locked the door, and tried to calm myself down. I told myself maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just another person walking through the neighborhood. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The way he had been so close, the way he hadn't made a sound, the way he had just watched me run. That night, I barely slept. For the next week, every little noise made me jump. I kept checking the locks, looking out the windows, listening for footsteps outside. I changed when I walked my dog, tried to go earlier, tried to bring someone with me when I could. Still, the feeling of being watched never really went away. About a week later, something happened that confirmed my fear. I woke up in the middle of the night to my dog howling. Not barking, not whining, but full-on howling like I had never heard before. His little beagle head was thrown back and he was losing his mind. That alone scared me. He was usually a calm dog. He didn't react like that for no reason. As I sat up in bed, I heard it. Someone was trying to get into my apartment. I could hear the door handle moving. The sound of someone testing it, pushing, pulling. My entire body went cold. I stayed completely still, listening, barely breathing. After a few seconds, the noise stopped. Then I heard footsteps. Whoever it was moved to the next apartment. I jumped out of bed, turned on every light in the apartment, and grabbed my phone. I started calling everyone I knew, friends, family, anyone who might answer. I also called the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what was happening. The police came and checked the area, but they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no suspect, nothing. They told me to keep my doors locked and call again if it happened. That night was one of the longest nights of my life. I sat awake with the lights on, my dog pressed against me, jumping at every sound. Even after the police left, I didn't feel safe. I felt exposed, like my apartment wasn't a barrier at all. Another week passed. Then my roommate came home one day with news that made my stomach drop. She told me that a police officer had spoken to her. Apparently, they had found a man hiding in bushes outside a nearby house, a house where some young girls lived. He had been watching the place, waiting. The police believed it was the same man connected to the other incidents in the neighborhood. They arrested him. He went to jail. After that, I never saw him again. But even though he was gone, the fear didn't disappear right away. For a long time, I couldn't walk my dog at night without feeling my heart race. I checked behind me constantly. I listened for footsteps. I trusted my instincts in a way I never had before. That experience taught me something important. Sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it doesn't come with noise or warning. Sometimes it's just a feeling, a sudden sense that something isn't right. And sometimes listening to that feeling can make all the difference. My two young daughters have always shared a room. From the time they were old enough to sleep on their own, they never wanted to be apart. We tried separate beds once, but that didn't last more than a night. They would climb into each other's space, crying until we finally gave in. So we bought a queen-sized bed and let them sleep together. After that, bedtime became easier. They felt safe together, and honestly, so did we. There was something comforting about knowing they weren't alone in the dark. For a long time, everything was normal. Nights were quiet, mornings were busy, and life moved on the way it usually does when you have young kids. Then, slowly, things began to change. At first, it was so small that we didn't think much of it. Our older daughter, only about a year older than her sister, started waking up in the middle of the night, crying. Not just normal crying, but deep, panicked sobbing. The kind that sounds like pure fear. It happened once, then again, then again. Soon it was happening. Every single night. We were concerned, of course, but we tried to be practical about it. Kids have nightmares. Kids have night terrors. We told ourselves this was probably just a phase. Maybe something she saw on TV, or something she overheard, or just her imagination growing faster than her ability to understand it. At first, when she woke up, she couldn't really explain what was wrong. She would just cry uncontrollably, cling to us, and beg not to go back to sleep. After a while, though, the crying turned into words. She started talking about the man. At first, it was vague. She would say things like, "The man was there," or "The man scared me." We asked gentle questions, trying not to feed into it. Who was the man? Where was he? What did he look like? Her answers were never clear, but one thing stayed the same every time. She always said the man was trying to get her. Night after night, the story repeated itself. The man did this. The man did that. The man was there again. The man was trying to get her. It was always the same fear, the same panic, the same desperation in her voice. What made it worse was how real it felt to her. This wasn't like a half-remembered dream. She was truly terrified. She started resisting bedtime altogether. She didn't want to go into the room. Sometimes she would stand in the hallway crying, begging us not to make her sleep there. What confused us even more was that our younger daughter didn't seem affected at all. She slept through the night. She didn't cry. She didn't talk about any man. She acted completely normal. Because of that, we kept telling ourselves this had to be nightmares. Kids can imagine very real things, especially when they're tired and scared. We tried everything. Nightlights, leaving the door open, sitting with her until she fell asleep. Nothing helped. As time went on, my mind started going to darker places. I began worrying about things I never thought I'd worry about. I started wondering if there was someone outside, some sick person sneaking around at night, watching the house, maybe even coming close to the windows. The thought terrified me. I checked the locks constantly. I inspected the windows. A few nights I stayed up late and sat quietly in their room after they fell asleep, watching, listening, waiting for something to happen. Nothing ever did. The house stayed quiet. The street outside was empty. No sounds, no shadows, no movement. Still, the nightly screaming continued. One night stands out more than all the others. Our older daughter woke up crying like usual, but this time she was burning up. She had a high fever and was shaking. We spent the entire night with her, taking turns holding her, comforting her, checking her temperature, whispering reassurances until morning finally came. It wasn't until the next day that we noticed the scratch. It was a thin red mark across her cheek. Not deep, but clearly there. My wife noticed it first. She reacted the way moms often do, trying to keep things light. She brushed her hair back and said softly, "Aw, sweetie, did you scratch yourself?" Before our older daughter could answer, our youngest spoke. She said it calmly. No fear, no emotion, just a simple statement. "No, Mama, the man scratched her last night." The room went completely silent. That was the first and only time our younger daughter ever mentioned anything about the man. She had never talked about him before, and she never did again after that. The way she said it still sends chills through me when I think about it. She didn't sound like a kid repeating something she'd heard. She sounded like she was stating a fact. My wife and I were completely shaken. We looked at each other unsure of what to say or do. Still, we tried to stay grounded. We told ourselves kids talk, kids imagine, kids say strange things. We didn't consider ourselves superstitious people. We didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything like that. So once again, we pushed it aside as best we could. Eventually, after a couple of months, the nightly episodes started to fade. The screaming stopped. The fear eased. Bedtime became normal again. It felt like a storm had passed. We were relieved. Life slowly went back to normal, and the story of the man became something we didn't talk about anymore. Then, a few months later, my wife had a friend come to visit for the weekend. She brought her daughter with her, a little girl around the same age as ours. Since our kids had the queen bed, it made sense to let the guest child sleep in their room. For the weekend, we moved our girls into our room. The first night went smoothly at first. After putting the kids to bed, the adults stayed up in the living room, talking and having a few drinks, enjoying the rare quiet. A few hours into the night, we heard crying. It came from the kids' room. We didn't think much of it at first. Kids cry for all sorts of reasons. especially in a new place. Our friend excused herself and went to check on her daughter. She was gone for a while, trying to calm her down and get her back to sleep. Eventually, she came back out carrying her daughter, who was still upset. She sat down and held her, gently rocking her, trying to soothe her. As time passed, the crying turned into soft sobs, then sniffles. When her daughter finally seemed calmer, her mom asked her what was wrong. She said it was very unlike her to get that upset, especially at bedtime. We were listening, but nothing had fully clicked yet. Then the little girl looked up at her mother and said, very clearly, the man in the room was trying to get me. I swear, the look on my wife's face and mine must have been something to see. My heart dropped into my stomach. Every hair on my body stood up. There was no prompting, no hesitation. She used the exact same words our daughter had used months before. That little girl refused to sleep in that room for the rest of the visit. They ended up sleeping on the couch. No amount of reassurance could convince her otherwise. The next day, we talked about it openly for the first time. We shared our story with our friend, and she was visibly shaken. Word got around among our friends, and eventually, one of our friend's mothers insisted on coming by. She believed in things we didn't, or at least didn't think we did. She brought oils, stones, and sage. She walked through the house, burning sage, saying prayers, placing things in corners. At that point, we were willing to try anything. After that, nothing else happened. No more crying, no more stories, no more man. The house feels normal now, peaceful even. But that story still lives in my head. It still creeps me to my bones. Even now, years later, when I walk past that room at night and hear my daughters breathing softly in their sleep, I sometimes wonder what it was they were so afraid of, and whether whatever it was ever really left, or if it simply stopped making itself known. This actually happened to me, not something I heard from someone else or read online later. At the time, I didn't think of it as a scary story. It was just supposed to be a stop on a long road trip, a way to stretch our legs and see something unusual before getting back on the highway. My girlfriend and I were on a cross-country drive, traveling from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Flagstaff, Arizona. It was one of those trips where you spend hours staring at desert, rocks, and sky, and you start looking for excuses to break the day up. Before we left, I had spent time researching places near Interstate 40 where we could stop without going too far off route. I wasn't looking for anything extreme, just something interesting enough to make the drive feel less endless. That's when I came across something online called the Apache Death Cave. It sounded dramatic, maybe even exaggerated, but it was described as being right off the highway, less than 2 hours from Flagstaff. According to the directions, it was so close to I-40 that you could practically see it from the road. That alone made it feel safe enough. It wasn't some deep wilderness hike or remote expedition, just a quick stop, take a look, and move on. When we got closer to the location, the area started to feel more empty. There were no signs pointing toward the cave, no tourist markers, nothing official at all. My GPS told me to take an exit, so I did, trusting it more than my instincts. We drove off the highway and onto a rough dirt road. It was rocky, uneven, and clearly not maintained. But there were a couple of other cars parked nearby. That made me feel better. It told me other people came here too, and that we weren't completely alone in the middle of nowhere. We parked and got out of the car. The air felt dry and still, the kind of quiet you only get in places far from towns and cities. There was an old stone structure nearby, half collapsed and worn down by time. A few people were walking around it, exploring, taking pictures. It looked abandoned and forgotten, but not threatening, at least not yet. We walked past the stone structure and followed a faint path that led toward the rocks. That's when we found the cave entrance. It wasn't marked or fenced off. It was just there, a dark opening in the rock, wide enough for a person to walk into without ducking. Standing at the entrance, I remembered what I had read online about the history of the place. According to what I found, this cave was where a group of Apache people had been cornered long ago after raiding nearby villages. The story said that Comanche warriors tracked them here. Instead of going into the cave and fighting them directly, they blocked off most of the entrance, leaving only a few small holes. Then they built a massive fire in front of it. The smoke filled the cave, and the people inside had no way out. They died from smoke inhalation. The number I remember reading was around 30 people, maybe more. That was where the name came from. Apache Death Cave. At the time, it felt like history. Tragic, brutal history, but distant. Something that happened so long ago, it didn't feel connected to the present. I had been in caves before, much deeper ones with friends. We always followed basic safety rules. We didn't go alone. We brought lights. We stayed aware of our surroundings. I felt confident enough to at least take a look. My girlfriend, on the other hand, wasn't as eager. She decided she wanted to go back to the car to change her shoes to something more comfortable. I told her I'd go in a little bit and wait. I stepped into the cave alone, letting my eyes adjust as best they could. I made it maybe 30 or 40 yards inside before I realized my phone flashlight wasn't nearly strong enough. The darkness swallowed the light almost immediately. The cave walls seemed to absorb it, leaving everything beyond a few feet in front of me completely black. I didn't like that feeling, so I turned around and went back to the car to grab my proper flashlight, one I trusted. When we both returned to the cave entrance, things felt different. Not dangerous, just heavier somehow. Still, we went in together. With both flashlights on, we walked deeper, step by step. The sound of our footsteps echoed strangely, bouncing off the rock in a way that made it hard to tell where the space opened up and where it narrowed. We were probably about 100 yards in when the cave opened up slightly. The ceiling rose and the walls pulled back just enough to give the impression of more space. It was still pitch black if we turned off the lights, but at least it didn't feel as tight. We kept going. The deeper we went, the quieter it felt. Not just quiet in sound, but quiet in a way that pressed against my thoughts. My girlfriend started to get uneasy. She said we were far enough and wanted to head back. I told her we could go just a little further, that we were already there, and it didn't make sense to turn around yet. We walked deeper, probably close to 200 yards in. At that point, she was clearly annoyed. She said she didn't like it, that it felt wrong, and that she wanted to leave. I was still focused on exploring, still convincing myself it was just a cave, just rocks and darkness. We stopped to argue about it, not a big fight, just frustration building between us. While we stood there, voices slightly raised, my girlfriend suddenly stopped talking. She went completely still and looked down at the ground. I followed her gaze. At our feet were 3 dead mice. At least, I think they were mice. They were small, rodent-like, but what caught my attention immediately was the way they looked. They weren't just dead. They were crushed, completely flattened, like something heavy had pressed them into the ground. There was blood around them and it looked fresh. Not dried, not dark. It was still red, still wet. For a moment, neither of us said anything. My brain struggled to make sense of it. How did that happen? What could have done that? We were deep inside a cave, far from the entrance, far from sunlight. There were no obvious tracks, no sounds, nothing to explain it. That was when the fear hit me. Not panic, not screaming fear, just a cold, heavy realization that we didn't belong there. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an overwhelming sense that we were being watched. Not imagined, not paranoia. It felt real, like eyes on us from somewhere in the darkness, beyond the reach of our lights. We didn't argue anymore. We didn't question it. We turned around and left. We walked fast at first, then faster. We didn't run, but every step felt urgent. Neither of us wanted to be the one to trip or fall. The darkness behind us felt alive, like it was closing in. I kept expecting to hear something, footsteps, breathing, anything, but the cave stayed silent. That silence was worse than noise. When we finally reached the entrance and saw daylight, it felt like breaking the surface after being underwater too long. We didn't stop to look back. We walked straight to the car, got in, and drove away, without saying much at all. Even now, I don't know what flattened those mice. I don't want to know. I don't try to explain it away anymore. What scares me the most is the thought that if we hadn't stopped to argue, if my girlfriend hadn't insisted on stopping, we might have walked straight into whatever did that. Sometimes stopping is what saves you. That cave still sits out there, just off the highway, unmarked and quiet. People probably still visit it, curious, unaware. But every time I think about it, I remember that feeling, that certainty that we were not alone and that whatever was there did not want to be seen. I was visiting Yellowstone National Park with a close friend, excited to finally see a place I had heard about my entire life. The park felt unreal, almost like another planet. Steam rose from the ground in different places, and the air smelled strange, like minerals and sulfur. We were walking along a marked path near one of the hot springs, taking photos and talking casually, not really thinking about danger. There were warning signs everywhere, but after a while you stopped truly noticing them. Everything felt calm and controlled. My friend had brought his dog along, and the dog was walking just ahead of us. Curious and energetic, it kept pulling slightly on the leash, wanting to sniff everything. We were being careful, staying on the path like we were supposed to. Then, in just a second, everything went wrong. The dog slipped on the edge near the spring. Before either of us could react, it lost its footing and fell straight into the hot water. The moment the dog touched the spring, it started screaming. The sound was horrifying. It wasn't like normal barking or whining. It was pure pain. That sound flipped a switch in my head. I didn't think about rules, danger, or consequences. I only saw an animal suffering right in front of me. I ran toward the spring without hesitation. I could hear people shouting behind me, telling me to stop, telling me not to go in. Their voices felt distant, like they were underwater. Nothing mattered except getting to the dog. I dove in head first, completely driven by instinct. The pain hit me instantly. It was overwhelming, like my entire body was being burned at once. It felt as if my skin was melting, as if fire had wrapped itself around me. My mind finally caught up with reality, and I realized I had made a terrible mistake. Panic rushed in. Somehow, through the pain, I forced myself to move and pulled myself back out of the spring within seconds. When I climbed out, everything went dark. I couldn't see anything at all. My eyes burned worse than anything I had ever felt before. I started panicking, spinning around, reaching out blindly. I kept saying the same thing out loud, over and over, that I had messed up. I knew deep down in that moment that my life had changed forever. Nothing felt real anymore, just pain, fear, and the heavy realization that one impulsive decision had altered everything. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, And in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.